The sky over Carthos 12 burned with a pale blue light that made the endless tundra shimmer like a sea of frozen glass. The planet's thin atmosphere allowed the sun's rays to pierce straight through, but the heat never reached the ground. The Galactic Academy transport descended through the stratosphere in a slow spiral, engines roaring against the howling wind, until it landed on a flat plateau of cracked permafrost. When the ramp lowered, a wave of air colder than death itself swept through the corridor, biting at exposed skin and freezing the moisture inside every cadet's breath. Among the dozens of recruits who stepped out into that merciless cold was a human named Elias Marin, a quiet figure wrapped in the standard issue survival suit that looked far too thin for the environment awaiting him. He had heard stories about Carthos 12, the world where endurance exams became legends and where even the strongest species often failed the trial before the second night. The instructors had gathered them in a half circle at the landing site, their faces hidden behind polarized helmets. One of them raised a metallic rod that projected a holographic map of the region, 100 kilometers of open plain surrounded by fractured cliffs and ice rivers. The rules of the exam were simple. Survive 7 planetary nights without technological shelters, without using heat modules, and without leaving the designated perimeter. The cadets could use only what the planet itself offered: minerals, soil, vegetation, and their own physical abilities. Elias listened as the alien cadets around him shifted restlessly. The avian Resar wrapped her wings tighter around her body. Her species came from a warm moon and could barely tolerate frost. The reptilian Kryvax licked his scaled lips, confident that his cold-blooded physiology gave him an advantage. Others muttered quietly, some already shivering even under the planet's weak daylight. When the announcement ended, the transport lifted off, leaving a swirl of powdered snow behind. The sound faded into the sky, and silence reclaimed the land. The wind swept across the field, sharp and ceaseless, whistling through the cracks in the frozen soil. Elias crouched down, scooping a handful of the dirt beneath the surface. It was not pure ice, as he had expected, but a mixture of compacted clay and mineral dust. It stuck slightly to his glove. That tiny observation planted an idea in his mind, but for now he said nothing. Most of the others were already scattering in different directions, trying to claim favorable terrain before darkness arrived. The planet's rotation was slow, and once the sun dipped below the horizon, the night would last nearly 20 standard hours. Elias adjusted the straps of his survival pack and began walking east, away from the cluster of cadets. The wind roared louder there, but the land sloped gently toward a depression between 2 ridges. The terrain was rough, marked by ripples of hardened clay. Every step cracked the surface, revealing darker soil underneath. He knelt again, pressing his gloved hand against the earth until he felt the faintest trace of moisture. It meant that the planet's atmosphere, despite its thinness, still allowed condensation to form beneath the surface. If clay existed here, it could be molded, shaped, and hardened by heat. If only he could find a way to generate warmth without violating the rules of the exam. Hours passed as the cadets settled across the plain. From the distance, Elias saw small clusters of figures, some building primitive windbreaks from ice shards, others attempting to dig shallow trenches. The insectoid Harnix species used their own secretions to create resin walls that hardened in minutes, while the mammalian crew from Rho Prime gathered fur hides and tried to build tents supported by bones of local creatures. Elias watched their frantic activity with quiet detachment. He had learned long ago that panic led to mistakes, and mistakes killed faster than the cold. Instead of rushing, he began collecting small stones and pieces of mineral debris scattered across the ground. He placed them in a semicircle to test their resistance to the wind. When a gust failed to move them, he smiled faintly. The ground had weight, and weight meant stability. As the pale sun began to sink, the light turned violet and the temperature plummeted. The air grew dense, turning each breath into a cloud of crystal vapor. Elias decided to establish his base in the shallow depression he had found earlier. He scraped the surface layer with a shard of metal from his kit, revealing damp clay underneath. The sight filled him with a strange calm. He removed his gloves and pressed his fingers into the soil, ignoring the sting of the cold. It was sticky, rich with silicates. Exactly what he needed. With slow, deliberate movements, he began scooping it into a pile. The clay clung together, forming dense clumps. He rolled them into rough spheres and pressed them together, building a small wall only half a meter high. From afar, it must have looked absurd. A single human kneeling in the middle of a frozen wasteland, sculpting tiny mounds of mud, while others constructed elaborate barricades. Yet to Elias, every movement had purpose. He remembered the history lessons from Earth, about early humans building clay ovens to survive winters, about the way fire hardened mud into stone. He knew the process could be replicated even here, where no firewood grew and the air itself seemed intent on extinguishing life. The first night approached. Darkness fell abruptly, swallowing the land in silence. The wind intensified, screaming across the plains with an almost living fury. Elias pulled his hood tight, securing the seals around his neck. He could see the faint lights of other camps flickering in the distance, blue and green flashes from portable plasma igniters, the last comfort before the instructors disabled them remotely. Then, one by one, those lights went out. What remained was pure darkness, broken only by the shimmer of the aurora above. The temperature dropped to lethal levels within minutes. The air crystallized, and even the exhaled breath froze in midair before falling like dust. Elias crouched behind his half-built wall, feeling the wind slice across his shoulders. His fingertips had gone numb, but he continued shaping the clay. Each handful he packed into place created another thin barrier against the wind. The walls began to form a curve, rising higher with every layer. By midnight, he had completed a crude dome barely large enough to crawl inside. It was imperfect, thin at the top, uneven at the sides, but it blocked the wind completely. He crawled inside and sealed the entrance with a block of snow, leaving a small vent at the top. The interior was pitch black, but the silence was absolute. The air inside already felt slightly warmer, though it was still below freezing. Elias placed a metal bowl in the center and scraped together a handful of wax from the emergency ration pack. Lighting it would cost him one of his few remaining matches, but he decided it was worth it. When the flame caught, a soft orange glow filled the space. The clay reflected the light, turning golden and alive. As the walls began to dry from the heat, the surface hardened, trapping the warmth inside. He sat quietly, listening to the faint hiss of the wind outside. Every gust made the dome tremble, yet it held firm. For the first time that night, he allowed himself to breathe slowly. Beyond his shelter, screams echoed faintly across the tundra. Cadets caught without cover, calling for help before the storm drowned their voices. He closed his eyes, forcing himself not to think about them. The trial was individual. Compassion could wait until morning. Hours passed in a haze of exhaustion. The flame flickered low, but the air inside the dome remained warm enough for him to remove his gloves and flex his fingers. The clay had hardened further, sealing in the heat. A thin crust of frost formed on the ceiling, sparkling in the dim light. Elias smiled faintly, realizing that he had just proven the most basic truth of survival. Shelter was not luxury, but instinct. Others had looked to the stars for technology, while he had looked to the ground. By the time the first light returned, a pale line across the horizon, Elias crawled out of the dome. The storm had passed, leaving drifts of snow piled against the walls. He stood up, stretching his aching limbs, and looked across the tundra. The camps of the others were in ruin. Torn fabrics fluttered like ghosts in the wind, and several motionless forms lay half-buried in snow. The reptilian Kryvax limped toward the ridge, his scales frost-bitten and cracked. The avian Resar sat motionless beside the remnants of her broken tent. Elias felt a sharp pang of pity, but said nothing. His dome stood unbroken, a small mound of clay gleaming in the pale morning sun. As he looked upon it, he realized that it was not only a shelter, but a promise. If one human could build warmth from the frozen earth of Carthos 12, then survival was not about biology or technology. It was about the will to adapt. He pressed his hand against the hardened clay, feeling the faint residual warmth through the surface. The trial had only begun, yet in that moment he already knew that this planet would remember the touch of human hands long after the others had gone. The second morning on Carthos 12 began in a fragile silence, broken only by the slow, rhythmic groaning of the ice beneath the planet's crust. The horizon was a line of blinding silver, and the air shimmered with frost dust that danced like ash in the weak sunlight. Elias stepped out of his clay dome, his breath forming clouds that drifted away and vanished instantly. The dome stood solid and unbroken, its surface hardened overnight by the alternating freeze and heat from the small candle he had burned. What had begun as a desperate experiment had turned into something remarkable, proof that even in the most hostile world, the ground itself could be shaped into life's protection. He rubbed his numb hands together and looked around. The plain stretched endlessly in every direction, but he could already see the remains of the other cadets' shelters scattered across the tundra. Many had collapsed during the storm. Patches of alien gear lay half buried in snow, and only a few moving figures indicated survivors. He saw Kryvax, the reptilian cadet, stumbling through the frost, his scales dull and cracked from exposure. The avian Resar sat slumped near a ridge, wings tucked close, her plumage frozen solid. Further in the distance, the insectoid cadet Harnix was scraping at the ground, trying to repair what remained of his resin shell. The night had shown no mercy. Elias watched them for a moment and then turned back to his own shelter. He knew that pity could be fatal out here. Survival demanded focus. He crouched and ran his gloved fingers across the dome's surface. The clay had hardened enough to withstand the cold, but it still carried small fractures where the temperature had shifted too fast. He decided to reinforce it. He walked toward a shallow ravine where he remembered seeing a patch of darker soil the day before. His boots crunched through the frost, each step echoing in the thin air. When he reached the spot, he knelt and used his knife to scrape through the upper crust. The soil beneath was soft and moist, slightly warmer than the surface. He realized that this part of the ground absorbed heat during the short daytime hours and retained it longer. He dug out several handfuls of this darker clay and placed them in a metal container. As he worked, the wind began to rise again, carrying thin streams of powdered snow. He ignored it and focused on the rhythm of movement. Dig, scoop, pack, carry. Every motion helped him forget the exhaustion creeping through his body. Back at his camp, Elias mixed the new clay with snow until it became pliable again. He used the mixture to patch the cracks on the dome, pressing the material firmly with his palms. The sound of his gloves against the clay was steady and slow, and soon his body found a kind of meditative rhythm. The work calmed him, even as the wind howled louder. Once the cracks were sealed, he began experimenting with the shape. The first dome had been functional but crude. This time he wanted to create something that could trap heat more efficiently. He knelt in the snow, tracing shapes with a metal rod, drawing curves and arches. His mind worked like a builder's blueprint, calculating angles, imagining airflow, remembering the way heat had collected in the small space the night before. By midday, he had built a new section, a half-sphere extension connected to the main dome. He shaped the walls thicker, using stones at the base to anchor them against wind pressure. The entrance, once a simple gap sealed with snow, was now a tunnel sloping slightly downward to prevent drafts. Inside, he created a small pit, lined with hardened clay, where he could light a controlled flame. The temperature difference between the interior and exterior was already noticeable. His breath inside no longer froze in the air but rose in faint steam, disappearing against the curved ceiling. As Elias worked, movement caught his attention from the distance. Kryvax was approaching, his posture stiff and awkward. The reptilian's thick tail dragged behind him, leaving a trail in the snow. He stopped a few meters away, eyeing the clay structure with visible disbelief. His species relied heavily on external heat sources, and the cold was eating at his strength. "What is this?" Kryvax rasped, his voice hoarse and brittle. Elias stood, brushing clay off his gloves. "Shelter," he answered simply. Kryvax stared at the dome, his vertical pupils narrowing. "You made this from dirt?" he asked, almost as if the idea offended him. Elias only nodded. "It holds heat. It works." The reptilian exhaled a cloud of frost, muttering something in his language. After a long pause, he asked, "You will let me stay inside?" Elias studied him for a moment. He could see the tremors in the reptilian's hands, the way his scales had lost their usual sheen. Compassion stirred in him, but he also remembered the rules. No teamwork, no shared shelters. The trial was meant to test individuals. Still, he couldn't watch another being freeze to death in front of him. "You can stay for the night," he said finally, "but you'll help me reinforce the others tomorrow." Kryvax nodded weakly, relief flickering in his eyes. The two worked side by side for the rest of the day. Kryvax's claws, though dull from the cold, helped dig clay faster than Elias could alone. Together they built a second smaller dome nearby, copying the design. The reptilian marveled at how the clay hardened under the faint warmth of the sun, turning into a shell tougher than ice. This could save everyone, he murmured once. Elias didn't answer. He didn't see himself as a savior. He was just doing what needed to be done. By the time the twin suns dipped below the horizon, the second dome was complete. Elias gathered a few fat scraps from his ration kit and lit another small flame inside his shelter. The air grew warm quickly, and the walls glowed softly in the dim light. Kryvax entered, sitting near the entrance. His scales absorbed the warmth greedily, and he let out a low sigh that almost sounded like gratitude. Elias leaned back against the wall, his mind heavy with fatigue. Outside, the storm began again, but the sound of the wind no longer filled him with dread. The clay muted everything, turning the roaring world into a distant hum. Hours passed in quiet. Elias dozed lightly, listening to the crackling of the candle and the faint breath of his companion. At some point, Kryvax spoke. "You humans," he said, voice slow. "You are strange. No fur, no scales, no armor. Yet you live everywhere. How?" Elias opened his eyes, staring at the glowing walls. "Because we build," he answered softly. "When we don't have what we need, we make it." Kryvax seemed to think about that for a long time, then nodded. "Maybe that's why your kind survived so long," he murmured before falling silent. When dawn returned, the storm had calmed. Elias stepped outside, his boots sinking slightly into a new layer of snow. The plain looked like a frozen ocean, endless and glittering. Smoke rose faintly from his vent holes, proof that the domes were still radiating heat. He looked toward the distance where other cadets' camps had been, and saw no movement. Only a few shapes remained, still and lifeless. He turned away, feeling a pang of quiet determination. The second night had killed more than the first. The instructors watching from orbit probably expected the trial to end with only a handful of survivors. But Elias was not planning to merely survive. He was planning to live through it in warmth and stability. He spent the day improving the structure even further. He learned that layering clay with thin sheets of ice created a kind of natural insulation that trapped heat even more effectively. He lined the floor with moss he had found near the ravine, and when it dried, it became a soft padding that insulated his body from the frozen ground. Kryvax followed his instructions and built his own smaller dome beside the first. Soon the two shelters stood like twin hearts in the wasteland, symbols of defiance against nature's cruelty. When the sun began to fade again, Elias climbed a nearby ridge to survey the area. The view stretched endlessly in all directions. The faint traces of the other camps had vanished beneath snow, but in the middle of the vast emptiness, two small domes stood proudly, each one steaming faintly under the dying light. He felt a strange sense of accomplishment, not pride, but quiet certainty. The planet had tried to crush him, but instead it had given him the materials to create. As he descended back toward his shelter, the wind whispered across the frozen plain like a distant voice. He paused for a moment, listening, and then smiled to himself. The trial was no longer just about endurance. It had become a conversation between man and world, between the elements and the will to adapt. He entered his dome once more, sealed the entrance, and let the warm darkness embrace him. The night outside could rage and howl as much as it wanted. Inside, there was peace. Inside, there was life. By the third day, the frozen plains of Carthos 12 had grown eerily quiet. The screams, the frantic movements, and the flashes of alien distress that had filled the first nights were gone. The storm had stripped the land clean, leaving behind nothing but endless whiteness stretching to the horizon. The only signs of life were the two small clay domes that stood like scars of defiance in the cold. Elias stepped outside his shelter, squinting against the blinding reflection of the sun on snow. The air was still thin and brutal, biting at his exposed skin, even through layers of insulated fabric. But inside, he carried a strange warmth that had little to do with fire, something that came from the knowledge that he had built life out of dead soil. Kryvax was already outside, crouched near his own smaller dome. He was using his claws to carve marks into the hardened clay, reinforcing the weak points that had formed overnight. His movements were slower now, deliberate and heavy. The reptilian's body was not built for such cold, and though his scales had regained some sheen from the heat of the night, exhaustion clung to his every gesture. Elias approached him, his boots crunching in the frost. "We'll need to make more before the next storm," he said. Kryvax looked up, blinking his vertical pupils. "For what purpose? The others are gone. We are the last." Elias shook his head. "No. I saw movement near the ridge at dawn. Someone's still out there." He pointed toward the distant line of cliffs where faint shadows had flickered earlier. Kryvax followed his gaze but said nothing. He didn't believe survival was possible for anyone who hadn't found shelter by now. Still, Elias couldn't ignore what he'd seen. He packed a small bag with hardened clay pieces, a metal tool, and the remaining scraps of animal fat he used for light. Before leaving, he turned back to Kryvax. "Keep the fire going. I'll be back before nightfall." The reptilian hesitated, his breath fogging in the air. "If you die out there, I won't come looking for you." Elias smirked faintly. "Then make sure my dome stays standing. It'll save you the trouble of building another." Without waiting for a reply, he started toward the ridge. The journey was harder than he expected. The snow had frozen into jagged plates that cracked under each step, revealing patches of dark ice beneath. The wind howled intermittently, lifting clouds of white powder that stung his face. Every few minutes he stopped to rest, scanning the horizon for movement. Once he saw a flash of color, something green and faintly metallic. He followed it until he came across a half-collapsed survival tent buried under snow. Inside lay a female cadet from the avian species Resar, still alive but barely conscious. Her feathers had turned brittle and frost covered her eyelids. When she saw him, her beak parted in a weak attempt to speak, but no words came out. Elias knelt beside her, checking her pulse through the fabric of her suit. It was faint but steady. He lifted her carefully, wrapping her in an emergency blanket from his pack. Her body was light, almost weightless, her bones delicate like hollow reeds. The walk back felt endless. The extra weight slowed him down, and the cold seeped through his muscles. More than once he thought of stopping to rest, but the thought of leaving her behind disgusted him. He wasn't sure why. Perhaps because on some instinctive level, he still believed that no one deserved to die alone under an alien sky. When he finally saw the smoke rising from his dome in the distance, relief almost made him stumble. Kryvax stood outside when Elias arrived, his tail lashing in agitation. The reptilian's eyes widened when he saw the limp form in Elias's arms. "You brought her here," he hissed. "The rules forbid cooperation. This could disqualify us both." Elias ignored him and pushed past toward his shelter. "Then we'll survive disqualified," he muttered. Inside, the air was still warm. He laid the avian cadet near the clay wall and unwrapped her. Her breathing was shallow, her skin nearly translucent beneath the feathers. He melted snow in his metal bowl and trickled warm water into her beak. Slowly she stirred, blinking weakly. "You, human," she croaked, her voice a whisper of air. Elias nodded. "Yes, you're safe now." She looked around, confused by the glowing walls and the faint orange light. "Clay, you built this?" He smiled faintly. "From the ground itself." Kryvax stood at the entrance, glaring. "You risk us both. If the instructors see this, they will end your trial." Elias turned toward him, his expression calm but cold. "Then let them. We weren't sent here to follow rules. We were sent here to survive." The reptilian's nostrils flared, but he said nothing more. He retreated to his own dome, leaving Elias alone with the girl. He worked for hours, feeding her small drops of melted water and sharing bits of his rations. She said her name was Errol. She had tried to build shelter using resin like the others of her kind, but the wind had shattered it. She had spent the storm half buried in snow, praying for dawn. Her feathers were still fragile, but she could speak now. "You humans," she whispered, "always find ways to make the impossible real." Elias chuckled softly. "It's not magic," he said. "It's stubbornness." That night, the storm returned earlier than expected. The wind struck like a living force, screaming against the domes. The air pressure shifted violently, and the temperature plunged to deadly lows. Elias reinforced the entrance with blocks of snow and clay, sealing every gap. The interior grew dim as the last sliver of light vanished. He lit his remaining candle, its flame flickering wildly before stabilizing. The heat was faint, but steady. Errol lay wrapped in layers of fabric, shivering but alive. The sound of the storm outside was deafening, but inside, the clay walls vibrated gently instead of cracking. The structure was holding. Hours passed, measured only by the rhythm of wind and flame. At one point, Kryvax's muffled voice called from outside. "Your dome. The roof is icing. It might collapse." Elias grabbed his metal tool and crawled through the narrow tunnel to the outside. The storm's fury hit him like a wall. Snow whipped across his face, but he saw what Kryvax meant. The upper layer of his dome was forming a heavy shell of ice. If it grew thicker, it could break the structure from within. He climbed to the top and began scraping it off carefully, using both hands. His gloves froze stiff within minutes, but he kept working. Kryvax appeared beside him, his scaled body covered in frost, helping without a word. The wind howled around them, trying to rip them from the surface, yet they worked together until the load lightened and the pressure eased. When it was finally safe, the two descended, collapsing in the snow for a moment. Kryvax laughed bitterly. "You risked yourself for a stranger," he said. "Why?" Elias looked at him through the haze of blowing snow. "Because no one survives alone forever," he replied simply. Then he stood and returned to the dome, sealing it once more. Errol was awake, her golden eyes wide with fear. He reassured her quietly, telling her the worst was over, even though the storm still roared outside. By morning, the world was unrecognizable. The snow had buried everything but the tops of their domes. The sky was a dull gray, heavy with mist. Elias crawled out and stood on the mound of snow, breathing deeply. His muscles ached, his skin burned from frostbite, but his spirit felt stronger than ever. The dome had survived another night. The human design, clay, snow, and heat, had proven unbreakable even under the planet's most violent conditions. Kryvax joined him a moment later, his breath hissing softly through his fangs. 3 nights, the reptilian said. 4 remain. Elias nodded, scanning the horizon. The trial was only halfway done, but something fundamental had changed. What had begun as a test of endurance had turned into a testament to creation. The shelters were no longer mere survival tools. They were symbols of defiance, monuments to the ingenuity that set his kind apart. As he looked at the 2 domes standing side by side, Elias felt a quiet certainty settle in his chest. He wasn't just surviving Carthos 12 anymore. He was shaping it, bending its frozen will to human design. And for the first time since the trial began, he felt the faint, undeniable pull of victory whispering through the icy air. By the 4th day, the trial on Carthos 12 had turned into something no one at the Galactic Academy could have predicted. The surface of the planet was buried beneath meters of layered frost and compressed snow, and only faint humps indicated where the domes of Elias, Kryvax, and Errol stood. The temperature had fallen to the lowest point yet, reaching a lethal -90. The sun hung pale and motionless, its light too weak to give warmth, casting everything in tones of blue and silver. Elias emerged from the narrow tunnel of his shelter, his eyelashes crusted with frost. The air hit his lungs like knives, and he had to pause, bending slightly forward to catch his breath. Above him, the wind moaned across the plains, endless and hollow, as if the planet itself whispered a challenge to those still alive. Inside the dome, Errol slept, recovering strength faster than Elias had expected. Her feathers were beginning to regain their sheen, and her voice was no longer fragile. Kryvax, ever restless, had already begun expanding his own dome the night before, experimenting with thicker clay layers and smaller air vents. Elias walked to him slowly, his boots sinking ankle-deep in the snow. Kryvax turned when he approached, his scales glistening faintly with frost. "We'll need to reinforce the structures again before the next storm," Elias said, his voice muffled by the scarf covering his mouth. "The temperature is dropping faster every cycle." The reptilian nodded. "I can feel it in my blood," he answered quietly. "It is slowing. Soon I will not move as I do now." Elias studied him for a moment and then said, "Then we'll build faster." He pointed toward the horizon where a ridge of dark rock jutted out of the snow, like the spine of a buried creature. "We'll dig there. The soil may be denser, may be warmer near the base." Kryvax looked doubtful, but he followed. The two made their way through the biting wind, dragging crude sleds made from the remains of survival packs. It took nearly an hour to reach the ridge. The ground there was indeed different, less frozen, the color shifting from pale gray to reddish brown. Elias knelt and struck it with his metal tool. The sound was dull, solid. He began to dig. Kryvax joined him, his claws scraping rhythmically against the surface. Soon they uncovered a deep layer of clay mixed with mineral dust that smelled faintly metallic. When Elias touched it, it was cold, but not as brittle as the material near their camp. This clay could be stronger, more resilient. They gathered as much as their sleds could carry and returned, their bodies stiff and aching from the cold. The sun had begun its slow descent, and shadows stretched long over the snow. As soon as they reached the domes, Elias began mixing the new clay with melted snow, kneading it until it turned smooth. He spread it across the outer walls, creating a second layer like armor. Kryvax copied his motion silently, his claws slicing through the mix. The repetitive motion of building calmed them both, giving rhythm to the endless monotony of survival. When night fell, Elias lit the small pit fire again, its flicker dancing on the walls. Inside, Errol was awake, sitting cross-legged near the flame. She watched him work in silence before saying softly, "The instructors must be watching us now. I wonder what they think." Elias smiled faintly, his hands never stopping. "Probably that we broke the rules," he said, "or that we broke the planet." She tilted her head, her golden eyes glinting in the dim light. "You think this will last? These domes, this warmth, it feels almost like home." He paused and looked at her. "That's the point," he said. "Home isn't where we start, it's where we survive." She smiled faintly and turned her gaze toward the flame. Later that night, when both of his companions had fallen asleep, Elias stepped outside again. The stars above Carthos 12 were sharp and cold, unmoving in the blackness. He looked at the vast horizon and realized how utterly silent the world had become. The trial had begun with dozens of cadets, yet now only 3 remained alive that he knew of. Somewhere out there, perhaps a few others had survived, clinging to improvised shelters or buried beneath snow. But he doubted it. The planet was too merciless, too patient. It waited for weakness, and weakness was everywhere. He brushed his gloved hand across the surface of his dome. It was warm under the outer crust, humming faintly with retained heat. The clay had hardened into something almost stone-like. The human instinct to build, to adapt, had turned raw survival into architecture. Suddenly he heard a distant crack, a deep rumbling sound that rolled across the plains like thunder. The ground trembled faintly beneath his boots. He froze, scanning the horizon. A dark fissure had appeared several hundred meters away, stretching like a scar through the ice. He felt the vibration run through his legs, and his instinct screamed that something dangerous was happening beneath the crust. He rushed back to the domes and shouted to Kryvax and Errol, "Out now! The ground's moving!" Kryvax emerged immediately, alert despite the cold. Errol followed, clutching a fur wrap around her shoulders. The fissure widened with a groaning sound that echoed across the emptiness. Steam began to rise from it, carrying the scent of minerals and heat. Kryvax hissed softly. "Thermal vent," he said. "The planet bleeds warmth." Elias's heart pounded as he realized the opportunity before them. "If that vent releases heat, we can use it," he said quickly. "We could channel the steam under the domes. It could keep us warm for the rest of the trial." Kryvax hesitated. "Or burn us alive if it bursts." Elias ignored the warning. "We'll control it." The idea had already taken hold in his mind. The planet itself was giving them a new tool, and he wasn't about to waste it. He led the others closer to the fissure, careful with every step. The crack glowed faintly red inside, where molten rock shimmered far below. The heat rising from it was gentle, barely enough to thaw the air, but compared to the killing cold, it felt like life itself. Elias knelt and began sketching lines in the snow with his finger. "We dig small tunnels connecting this to our camp. We coat the channels with clay, so the steam moves evenly. If we do it right, the heat will flow under the domes without flooding them." Kryvax grunted, half in disbelief, half in admiration. "You are insane," he muttered. "Yes," Elias replied, "but it works." For the next hours, they worked without rest. Kryvax dug deep trenches, his claws cutting through the ice like blades. Errol carried buckets of clay, her delicate frame shivering each time the wind rose. Elias oversaw the shaping of the tunnels, ensuring each one sloped downward toward the fissure, but angled enough to keep the heat from escaping too fast. The work was brutal. Their hands bled from cold burns, and the air round the vent shimmered with distortion. but by dawn, a network of clay-lined tunnels connected the fissure to the domes. Elias sealed the final joint with a layer of hardened mud and stepped back. "Now," he said softly, "let the planet breathe for us." Within an hour, the difference was clear. The interior of the domes grew warmer, not from fire, but from the faint pulse of heat traveling through the clay beneath their feet. The walls no longer froze at night. The air remained still and soft. For the first time since the trial began, Elias removed his gloves and felt the air on his skin without pain. Errol laughed quietly, a sound so light and foreign against the endless silence that it startled both men. Kryvax's cold eyes softened. "You've done it," he said, shaking his head. "You've turned this dead world into a hearth." Elias looked around the camp. 3 domes now, their clay surfaces steaming faintly in the frigid air, and allowed himself a rare smile. As night fell again, the aurora shimmered overhead, painting the sky in ribbons of green and violet. The ground beneath their camp glowed faintly from the hidden warmth. Elias sat outside for a long time, watching the light and listening to the low hum of the earth. The planet no longer felt like an enemy. It felt alive, ancient, powerful, and strangely willing to help those who understood how to listen. He realized that survival was not about resisting nature, but learning its language, bending its force into harmony. He thought of the others who had laughed at him on the first day, who had dug shallow holes in the ground believing instinct alone would save them. Those holes had become graves. His domes, however, had become homes. When he finally returned inside, Errol was asleep again, her breathing steady and calm. Kryvax sat near the vent opening, watching the flicker of light that pulsed through the clay. "You know," the reptilian said quietly, "if you live through this, your kind will speak of this trial for generations." Elias smiled faintly. "Then let them remember what we built here," he said. "Not how we suffered, but how we made the cold kneel." He leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes as the heat radiated upward, mingling with the rhythm of his heartbeat. Outside, the wind no longer howled like a threat. It sounded instead like applause. The last night on Carthos 12 began with silence so complete it felt unnatural. The wind had stopped entirely, and the air hung heavy, dense with frost and faint mineral steam. The aurora had faded to a dull gray curtain above the horizon, and the stars seemed to burn lower, closer to the surface, like lanterns hung by unseen hands. Elias woke before dawn, though the light outside had not changed in days. His breath came out in small clouds as he sat inside his dome, listening to the faint rhythmic sound of the earth's pulse below, the heat from the fissure that now fed life into their small camp. He felt the weight of exhaustion pressing on every muscle, but his mind was sharper than ever. The end of the trial was near, and survival was no longer uncertain. It was inevitable. Errol was awake too, quietly packing what little she had left into a bundle of cloth, a metal flask, a piece of ration, and a single feather that had fallen from her wing the first night she had nearly died. She tied the bundle carefully and looked at Elias. "Do you think they'll come today?" she asked softly. Her voice carried the same tremor as the wind before a storm, fragile yet full of life. Elias didn't answer at once. He stood and brushed his hand across the clay wall, which was still warm from the tunnels beneath. "They'll come when the trial clock ends," he said finally. "But I don't think we're finished yet." She tilted her head. "What do you mean?" He turned toward the horizon. "This planet isn't done testing us." He stepped outside. The light was dim, almost metallic, and the air shimmered faintly above the fissure's ridge. Kryvax was already there, crouched near the steam vents. His scales gleamed with condensation, and thin trails of vapor rose around him like smoke. When Elias approached, the reptilian looked up. "The heat flow is changing," Kryvax said. "The pressure beneath the surface is building. I can feel it in the ground." Elias knelt, placing his gloved hand on the ice. He could sense it too, a slow, rhythmic vibration growing stronger with each pulse, like a heartbeat turning into a tremor. He frowned. "If the vent erupts, it'll destroy the tunnels. The domes will collapse." Kryvax exhaled through his fangs. "Then we move away from it." Elias shook his head. "If we lose the heat, we freeze. If we stay, we burn." He stood up, scanning the landscape. The snow near the fissure had begun to melt in irregular patterns, forming thin streams that snaked across the plain. The air was thickening with sulfur and steam. "We can't fight it," Elias said quietly, "but we can shape it." He turned to Kryvax with a sudden glint of determination. "Help me divert the pressure." The reptilian stared at him for a moment, then nodded once. Without another word, the two began digging parallel trenches from the fissure outward, aiming to redirect the flow of heat away from the domes and into the open plain. Errol joined them soon after, her small frame shivering under the biting wind, but she carried buckets of clay and water without complaint. For hours they worked in silence, their bodies moving through instinct, not thought. As the ground trembled harder, the air filled with a low rumble that grew into a thunderous roar. The fissure split wider, releasing a burst of glowing steam that painted the snow crimson. The blast knocked Elias to his knees. He covered his face, coughing as the heat rolled over him. Kryvax shouted something, his voice lost in the noise, but Elias could see him struggling to stabilize one of the channels. Errol was already retreating toward the domes, her wings shielding her from the blast of scalding vapor. Elias forced himself to his feet and rushed toward Kryvax. Together, they pressed clay and stone against the trench walls, sealing weak points and guiding the molten flow away from their camp. It was chaotic, dangerous work, each second closer to disaster, but slowly the ground stopped shaking. The tremor subsided into a deep hum, and the light beneath the fissure dimmed again. When the last of the steam cleared, the three of them stood in the pale sunlight, covered in ash and streaks of clay. The fissure still glowed faintly, but the danger had passed. Kryvax looked at Elias with something close to respect. "You don't stop," he said quietly. "Even when the planet itself fights you." Elias managed a faint smile. "Stopping is dying." Errol approached, wiping soot from her feathers. "The vent stabilized," she said softly. "The heat is steady again. The domes will hold." Elias nodded, though his strength was nearly gone. He could feel every bone in his body aching. "Then we made it," he whispered. "We've done what no one else did." Hours later, the first sound of engines echoed across the sky. The Galactic Academy's transport ship descended through the clouds, its metallic hull shining against the gray light. It landed on the plain with a low rumble, sending waves of snow outward in a perfect circle. The hatch opened, and a group of instructors stepped out, their white armor gleaming. They looked around at the desolate landscape, at the empty spaces where other camps had been, and finally, at the three figures standing beside steaming domes of clay. One of the instructors removed his helmet, his expression unreadable. "Cadet Elias Marin," he called out, his voice amplified by the helmet speaker. "Kryvax of Varin and Errol of Res Prime. Step forward." Elias obeyed, his steps heavy but firm. The instructor studied the structures behind him, the layered clay domes connected by faintly smoking vents, and then turned back to him. "Explain what you did here." Elias hesitated for a moment before answering. "We used the planet," he said simply. "Its soil, its heat, its air. We stopped fighting it and made it work with us." The instructor's eyes narrowed slightly. "You broke every standard rule of isolation and conduct. You built permanent structures. You aided others. Yet you survived when all others failed." His voice softened just enough to hint at awe. "Do you understand what that means?" Elias met his gaze. "It means we didn't follow the trial," he said. "We changed it." There was a long silence before the instructor spoke again. "The Academy will review this outcome. But as of now, your performance exceeds any recorded attempt in this test." His gaze moved across the three survivors. "You did not just endure, you adapted. That is the essence of evolution." He stepped aside, motioning toward the ship. "Return to the transport." As the three of them walked toward the ramp, Elias turned one last time to look at the domes. The steam rising from their vents shimmered in the light like faint smoke from an ancient village. He realized how strange it was that a world meant to kill them had instead become a place of warmth and life. For a brief moment, he felt almost reluctant to leave it behind. "You made something beautiful," Errol said softly beside him, as if reading his thoughts. "Not even our worlds have this kind of strength." He glanced at her, smiling faintly. "It's not strength," he said. "It's memory. This planet will remember us, even if we never come back." When the ship lifted off, the wind returned at last, swirling across the plain and carrying fine dust into the air. From above, the planet stretched vast and silent, marked by three small domes that glowed faintly with the warmth of human hands. The Academy instructors recorded their notes, but none of them could fully capture what had been born there. Carthos 12 had not been conquered. It had been transformed. As the ship rose through the gray clouds, Elias watched through the viewport until the surface disappeared beneath the mist. He felt no triumph, only a deep, steady peace. He thought of the others who had come before, those who had frozen, those who had failed, and he realized that survival was not about defying nature, but understanding it. The clay beneath his fingers, the heat in the tunnels, the fragile breath of life in the cold. These were not accidents of luck, but reminders of what humanity had always done best. Kryvax sat beside him, silent, his reptilian eyes reflecting the dim cabin light. Errol leaned against the wall, her wings folded carefully. None of them spoke as the ship broke through the atmosphere and into the vast black of space. Only when the engines quieted did Elias allow himself to close his eyes. The warmth from the planet still lingered in his mind, like a heartbeat beneath the surface of memory. Carthos 12 faded behind them, but its lesson remained. On every world, under any sun, humanity would build, endure, and create warmth where there was none. The cold could never win, not while even one human hand could turn dirt into shelter and silence into life. And so, the trial ended, not in survival, but in creation.